So welcome back. Our next speaker is Daniela Ozacky. Hello, thank you for joining the discussion. Daniela is a postdoctoral researcher of the Institute of Holocaust Research at WWII University, Israel. Her research titled The Escape of Jews to the Forests in Lithuania and Belarus during the Holocaust was conducted at the Yad Vashem International Institute for Holocaust Research. This is in parallel with her roles as the director of the Moreshet Holocaust Archive in Jewsby, Haviva, Israel, and a lecturer for Western Galilee College's Holocaust Studies program in Echo. The presentation is about Joseph Goebbels' Nazi propaganda and the Holocaust during the last year of World War II. Daniela, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and let me try to share my screen. Can you tell me if you can see it?
Yes, we can see.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I am honored to take part in this important conference. Today, we will talk about one of Hitler's closest aides whose influence on Nazi policy was immense, Joseph Goebbels. I will focus on the last year of the Second World War, which was also the last year in the life of Joseph Goebbels. On May 1st, 1945, a day after Hitler's suicide in his bunker in Berlin, Magda and Joseph Goebbels committed suicide, taking with them their 6 children. I will try to show how, as Germany was losing in all fronts, Goebbels rose to a personal high point. Despite its defeat during this last year of the war, Germany's motivation grew to hasten the extermination of the Jews and finish their great mission of the final solution. This mission was enabled to a large extent by the propaganda machine of Goebbels. Can you see the second slide now? Just want to make sure that it's
Yes, please.
Great. So who was Goebbels? He was an exception in Hitler's close surrounding. His intelligence, manners, and charisma stood out among the mediocrity and vulgarity of most members of the Nazi party. He was an intellectual. Unlike many party members, he didn't carry a pistol and preferred literature and culture over the battlefield. But he knew the power of words, and his speeches was often cruel. His associates shed light on these conflicting perspectives. I quote, "Was Goebbels a man who considered humans as objects to be used for political purposes? He didn't respect people. He had no consideration for anyone. He was only concerned about governing and was interested only in control, as Otto Ollendorf, head of Einsatzgruppe D, claimed." Another associate described him as follows. Superficially, he appeared intelligent, clever, and refined. He might have been a literary man or a professor of history. It was also said that his career is without any parallel in history and that he sees the worst side of every human being. But the harshest description of Goebbels came from his sworn enemy, Hermann Goering, commander of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, who in 1946 said, "That club-footed fanatic, he forced women to submit to him. He influenced Hitler to become anti-Semitic more than Hitler had been before. God knows what evil influence Goebbels had on him. Goering thought that Goebbels was using anti-Semitism merely as a means of achieving personal power, and that whether he had any deep-seated hatred towards the Jews is questionable. Goebbels wrote diaries for over 20 years, from 1923 up to his last days in April 1945 in the bunker in Berlin. He believed that in due time his diaries would prove to be a rich source of information on the Nazi movement. He also planned to retire from politics at the end of the war and dedicate himself to historical research as a chief historian of the Third Reich. He was born on 29 October 1897 in a small industrial town of Reit in the Rhineland to a Catholic family. Goebbels was handicapped, sensitive boy. His right leg was shorter than his left. A childhood disease left it paralyzed. This defect caused him to limp, which hurt his self-confidence. He studied literature and philosophy and did a PhD at the University of Heidelberg. His supervisor was Jewish. Goebbels met his wife, Magda, at work. She had a son from previous marriage. They married on December 1931 in a Nazi wedding. Hitler was the best man, and the men attending the ceremony wore the party uniforms. Since Hitler wasn't married, after her marriage to Goebbels, Magda became the first lady of the Third Reich, an example to Aryan women and the symbol of Germanic womanhood. The couple had 6 children, 5 daughters and a son, all given names beginning with the letter H to honor Hitler, a frequent guest in their home. In March 1933, at the age of 35, Goebbels was appointed to head the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. He now controlled Germany's press, radio, theater, and cinema. He influenced the creation of the Hitler's myth. Hitler's image as the true leader Germany was waiting for. But until the last year of the war, he didn't feel he's getting all the authorities he wanted. His opportunity to show his loyalty to the Nazi regime came on the afternoon of 20 July 1944. On that day, Klaus von Stauffenberg and other German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler. Hitler was saved by chance, but the event shook the top of the Nazi leadership. Such a conspiracy coming from within demanded a policy change. Goebbels identified an opportunity to press Hitler. He formed an alliance with Albert Speer, and together they cooperated to convince Hitler that a total war must be enacted immediately. Crazy times call for crazy measures, Goebbels said. It's interesting to note that when Goebbels could not locate Himmler that day, he believed that he was the one behind the attempted assassination. Following this game-changing day, Goebbels was shown at his best when he gave the difficult event a national meaning, which would lead to unifying the German folk with its leaders in a fateful, almost mystical union. July 20th was a turning point in the war and also in Goebbels' personal position. As he wrote in his diary, In fact, July 20th is not only our deepest low point in this crisis-ridden war, but also the significant day in our re-emergence. Goebbels became the most prominent advocate of radical policy and total war. He believed that at this point in the war, military force was not the only important thing for Germany's struggle, but also the mental and national cohesion at the home front. The civilians must be in danger just as much as the soldiers. In this last year of the war, Goebbels and Hitler still believed there was a chance to turn the war in Germany's favor. Hitler still relied on the Wehrmacht. At that time, Hitler spent night and day poring over maps which described the state of the war. He saw the war through the lens of discussions and documents, far from the blood and filth of the battlefield. At times, he would suggest military maneuvers and drew them on the maps with no relation to the real situation at the front. Hitler fell into a world of fantasy. He couldn't wake up from it to deal with reality. He even refused to accept reports of the destruction caused by Allied bombings. When Goebbels sent him an album depicting the damage caused by them, Hitler's secretary Martin Bormann sent it back with a note. The Führer did not wish to be worried with such irrelevant matters. Rudolf Themler, a high-ranking official in the Ministry of Propaganda, says that he first saw Goebbels lose control when he learned of the bombing of Dresden. I quote, "The tears came into his eyes with grief and rage and shock. He seemed a broken man." However, as Hitler sank deeper into delusions and had trouble functioning, Goebbels continued to visit bombed sites and the front, where he raised the spirit of the German soldiers. In a speech to German soldiers in Görlitz in March 1945, he spoke of the danger Germany faces. "The enemy is now at the gates of our city. It left us no doubt what it will do to us, to our wives, our children, and even our grandchildren and their children." The fear of the cruelty of Bolshevism was always highlighted in Nazi propaganda, in order to convince the Germans that victory was their only option. A Bolshevization of Germany meant not only enslavement, but a total annihilation of the German people. After the discovering of the Polish officers' massacre in the forest of Katyn, Goebbels mentioned it at every opportunity. It was an excellent anti-Bolshevik propaganda, which demonstrated the Soviet cruelty and proved what awaits Germany if it didn't win the war. On 14 April 1943, Goebbels wrote in his diary, "I gave instructions to make the widest possible use of this propaganda material." Goebbels hoped that the Katyn discovery would cause the Western allies to stop cooperation with the Soviet Union. When one of his clerks pointed out that if he wouldn't stop mentioning it, some might think that the Germans performed the massacre themselves, Goebbels answered, "No, no, my dear. In Katyn, it was no doubt the Russians. Our mass graves are located somewhere else." According to Themler, Goebbels' hatred of the Jews is fanatical. Everything Jewish is to him like a red rag to a bull. The hatred is so strong that he becomes incapable of even recognizing facts when he deals with them. Goebbels developed a pathological personal hatred of Jews. In March 1944, he wrote, "We employed such a radical approach only when concerned with the Jewish question. It was justified, and today we enjoy its fruits. The Jews cannot harm us anymore." He was aware of the magnitude of the extermination and didn't deny that it happened and that he was involved in it. He wrote in his diary, "Anyone in a position to do so should kill these Jews like rats. In Germany, thank God, we have already done a fairly complete job. I trust that the world will take its cue from this." In March 1945, he wrote, "No one can say with certainty which nations will be on the losing side and which on the winning side at the end of the war. But there can be no doubt that the Jews will be the losers." During the last year, when the military situation was so difficult and the Germans suffered heavy losses, he ordered the thousands of soldiers and sailors will be taken out of active service and assigned to act as extras in the epic propaganda film Kolberg, which he produced in mid-1944. It was the most expensive production in Germany. The movie describes the battle in which the citizens of Kolberg defended their town against the French forces. Goebbels hoped that the movie would strengthen German resistance. When it was clear they lost the war, Goebbels and Hitler still deliberated on what role they will play themselves. It seemed that eventually they both preferred death at the last resort. Joseph and Magda took the decision to move to the Führer's bunker together. Magda decided to commit suicide and take her 6 children with her. "We shall all die," she told her friend, "but by our own hands, not at those of the enemy." As a person who had a full life and a glorious career, Goebbels didn't want to end up in prison to be at the enemy's mercy. He would rather die a heroic death, as he so often preached. He must take part in the last scene in the history of the Third Reich. When all chances of a final German victory were lost, Goebbels chose to tie his fate and that of his family with Hitler's and planned their joint death. He sought to preserve the Führer's myth and give an air of ultimate self-sacrifice to the supreme leader, as well as to his own image, to be the most wonderful example of German loyalty. On the background of Nazi Germany's final downfall, Goebbels produced a Wagnerian ending of his life by committing suicide and taking his family with him. To sum up, let me say that even though Germany was defeated in the last year of the war, millions of Germans had continued to be captivated by an idea and ideology which ultimately led to their own destruction. They continue to support a leader whose mental and physical health deteriorated, but his charisma stayed intact. They continue the massive extermination of the Jews, murdering, among others, about 500,000 Hungarian Jews. There is no doubt. Goebbels' propaganda worked. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniela. Thanks a lot for this highly informative presentation, and thanks for keeping the time as well. And now this is the time for questions and comments. We've got 15 minutes, so please feel free to ask.
So thank you for this very interesting paper. And I'm thinking whether did Goebbels ever realize that the war was lost, or when did he realize that the war was lost? Or did he become the victim of his own propaganda? Or in other words, did he believe in the propaganda he created, or was he able to make difference between reality and his propaganda? So this is my question.
Thank you for this excellent question. So, as we know, after the Stalingrad defeat of the Germans, the war started to deteriorate for the Germans. And especially during the last year of the war, the year that we are talking about in this conference, the Germans suffered such a heavy losses. For example, I can give you a terrible statistic. During this last year of 1944 and 1945, about 1,400,000 German soldiers were killed in battle. So the magnitude of the suffering that the soldiers, the German soldiers, and the civilians with the Allied bombing suffered were immense. And it's interesting to go back to your question, because it seems to us that Goebbels stayed probably one of the only persons in the close circle of Hitler who stayed let's say, rational and understood what's going on. As you said, we can say that he became a victim of his own propaganda, but we can also say that he produced the ending that he wants for himself and for Hitler. By the way, Goebbels convinced Hitler to stay in Berlin and committed suicide. On 20 April 1945, Hitler celebrated his 56th birthday in the bunker. He received guests. We have testimonies that all the guests that came to congratulate Hitler tried to convince him to leave Berlin, to flee. The only one who convinced him to stay and to commit suicide was Goebbels. And so, yes, maybe today we can say he was a victim of his own propaganda, but maybe back then he thought that he is still in control. I hope it answers a little bit your question. And I think there was someone else who wanted to ask. I saw someone raising his hand. Okay, well, if you have any questions, you can also...
Sorry, I raised my hand. This is Geza Jasensky. Well, your talk was very informative, very enjoyable, and especially valuable were the pictures, the slides, which you showed. And one of the last was, it is not unknown that Goebbels is shaking hands with a young boy, I think in the very last moments. So my question is there any way to find out how large section of the German population were a victim of this brainwashing, especially in the very last weeks of the war, when after the bombing of Dresden and so on. So when no sane person could believe that the war could be won, nevertheless, there were these people, not only young boys, but of course, war-trained people who were still ready to fight on. So how was it possible that so many people could be fooled and brainwashed and to fight to the very end? Thanks.
Yes, you are right. It's really, really interesting for us today to look back and see that until the last minute, I mean, until Hitler's suicide, even the German army kept on fighting. The citizens of Germany kept on being starved and being in bunkers, in shelters, and suffer so much. And I'm not sure how many people truly believed the propaganda that Goebbels kept on activating until the last minute. I'm not sure what choice did they had. I can tell you that Goebbels, in the few hours he was the Germany's chancellor after the suicide of Hitler, Goebbels was appointed the chancellor. He tried to negotiate with the Soviets for peace treaty, and the Soviets didn't go for it. And then after his suicide on May 1st, 1945, Germany, a day after, surrendered with no conditions. So you can see that immediately after Hitler's and Goebbels' death, Germany surrendered. I believe so, that they, both of them, Hitler and Goebbels, they still captivated the German army and the civilians in this crazy propaganda.
But even Himmler tried to negotiate, as we know. So
right.
He was not as kind of determined as Goebbels.
Right. And this is why I think that the role of Goebbels in the Nazi regime, especially in this last year of the war and in the last days of Hitler, was so strong, because until the last minute, until the last day, Goebbels kept on feeding even Hitler his propaganda and his I'm not even sure it was a craziness, and it's go back to Tamas' a question or a remark about whether he truly believed he can make a difference for Germany. I think that they did at some point in the last year thought that they can change the war to their favor, as we saw in the production of the movie Kohlberg. He honestly believed that, for example, a movie like this can change the mentality of the citizens to continue their struggle, their resistance. But over the last days of their lives, I think it was already a done deal that Germany lost. It was just, it's very interesting to think about those questions and remarks.
Thank you. Any other questions, please?
Feel free to contact me also privately by email. I will be happy to answer any question.
Thank you. Okay. Now we've got 10 more minutes until Tamás start his discussion and presentation. So see you in some minutes, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.